Welcome back. Again, Pankaj from Sons of Technologies, and in this video we'll be looking about another widely asked interview question like how to identify either the exception is checked or unchecked exception. So let's find out the answer for the same. To see the answer for this question, let me go for our same Java FAQ folder and open the command prompt over here. So first of all, we have two types of exceptions. One is checked and one more is unchecked exception. First, let's see about unchecked exception. Again, I am using the same command javap and typing here arithmetic exception. So as we know, arithmetic exception is one of the type of unchecked exception. So when I press enter, it is showing me the details about arithmetic exception. Similarly, let's see another unchecked exception called as null pointer exception. You can notice one thing which is common in both, that is both extends from runtime exception class. Apart from this, let's take another example of unchecked exception, which is java.util.input mismatch exception. So this is another unchecked exception. When I press enter, you can notice it extends no such element exception. And now you just check out what does no such element exception extends from. And if you notice, this also extends from runtime exception. So this is to prove that any of the exception which extends directly or indirectly runtime exception comes under the category of unchecked exception. Similarly, you can even check out for array index out of bounds exception. Out of bounds exception, and this exception extends from index out of bounds exception. And if you again check index out of bounds exception, this comes under runtime exception. So in all these four cases, you can check that either the class is directly coming under runtime exception or indirectly coming under runtime exception. So all these exceptions comes under the category of unchecked exception. Similarly, if I want to find out about the checked exception, now let's again the similar way type here io exception, as io exception is one of the type of checked exception. And if I press enter here, you can notice the io exception extends from directly exception class. Similarly, another kind of checked exception is SQL exception. So if I type SQL exception, again we can check here the SQL exception also extends from exception class. And let's take another example, net.socket exception. And this socket exception extends from IO exception, and already we have seen that IO exception extends from exception class. So this is to prove that any class which extends directly or indirectly the exception class comes under checked exception. So a class which extends runtime exceptions is actually an unchecked exception, and a class which extends exception class is actually a checked exception. And also to add up, checked exceptions are those for which try and catch block is mandatory. Otherwise the program will not compile. And for unchecked exceptions, the try and catch block are optional. So without them also we can compile the program. But yes, if any exception occurs at runtime, then the program will terminate. So hence it is always better to handle the exception in the program regardless of it is checked or unchecked. So hope you have got the answer. Similarly, one more question, how to create custom checked or unchecked exception? So the answer for that is also the same. That is, if you want to create custom checked exception, you create your user defined class by extending the exception class directly. then you need to provide minimum these two constructors. One is without parameter and one is with string parameter. So you can notice this is actually a common thing in almost every exception class, that every exception class will have two constructors. One is without parameter and one is with string parameter. Not only with checked exception, even you can notice the same thing with unchecked exceptions, here as well as here. So minimum 2, you can have more than 2 constructors, but minimum 2 constructors. So this is the basic requirement to create a custom exception. So yes, again, if your custom class extends exception class with these two constructors, then we can say it is a checked exception. And if you want to create a custom unchecked exception, then your class should extend runtime exception class with again the two constructors. Fine. So that much only for this session. Thank you.